In the late 18th century, the American frontier was defined by conflicting maps. Pennsylvania and Connecticut held overlapping colonial charters for the Wyoming Valley, resulting in decades of localized violence between rival settlers claiming the exact same soil. The legal resolution to this territorial chaos arrived in April 1795 inside a Pennsylvania circuit court in the case of Vanhorne's Lessee v. Dorrance. This was a standard quiet title action over a single 198 parcel known as Lot Number 20, yet the dispute required a precise evaluation of the legal boundaries of state power. Presiding over the trial was Supreme Court Justice William Patterson. After a 15-day trial, Patterson delivered a sprawling jury charge that evaluated every piece of evidence and every underlying legal doctrine. The facts required Patterson to answer a single, severe question. To resolve a political crisis, can a state legislature legally enact a statute that strips a perfected land title from one citizen and gives it to another? By dissecting Patterson's charge, we can observe the mechanical blueprint for judicial review and the limits of eminent domain, recorded years before the Supreme Court formally addressed these concepts in Marbury v. Madison. This charge records the judiciary operating as a coordinate branch of government, capable of voiding a legislative act by measuring it against the written Constitution. Patterson begins by evaluating the plaintiff. Thomas Vanhorne exhibited an unbroken chain of title that traced chronologically back to the original charter granted by King Charles II to William Penn. Vanhorne proved his claim by exhibiting the official warrants to survey the land and the separate returns recorded in 1771, which established his proprietary rights over Lot 20. The defendant, John Dorrance, occupied Lot 20. He derived his competing title from the state of Connecticut, rooted in an initial 1754 land deed purchased from Native American tribes. Patterson identifies a geographic failure in this claim. The land in controversy is exterritorial. It falls entirely outside the legal charter bounds of Connecticut, meaning Connecticut had no sovereign authority to grant title there. This is the primary evidence the defense relied upon, the 1754 Indian deed. Patterson instructed the jury to inspect this document, noting an unauthorized razure, a physical alteration made after execution, and observed it lacked a typical public execution. The final defect in the defense's title is statutory. A 1705 Pennsylvania law explicitly voided any land purchases made from Native Americans within its borders, if the buyer lacked permission from the proprietary government. The legal conclusion is rigid. The Connecticut settlers purchased the land without leave and entered upon it without right. Under the law, they were classified strictly as trespassers. Because standard property law heavily favored the Pennsylvania claimants, the state legislature faced the prospect of evicting hundreds of entrenched Connecticut settlers. To avoid a localized war, the Pennsylvania legislature intervened. The legislature's solution was passed on March 28, 1787. It was called the Confirming Act. The Confirming Act operated in 3 steps. First, the legislature severed the disputed land from the Pennsylvania owners. Second, it automatically vested that property into the Connecticut settlers. Third, the state offered the dispossessed owners equivalent vacant land elsewhere. To enforce this, the legislature created a board of property. This state-appointed board possessed the sole authority to judge the validity of the claims and the value of the equivalent vacant land. By executing the Confirming Act, the legislature assumed it possessed supreme authority to reorganize private property for the public good, without any participation from the judicial branch. Before analyzing the Confirming Act, Patterson asks a structural question. Does an American legislature actually possess the authority to enact such a sweeping divestment of property? The English parliamentary system provided the default for early American thought.
Lacking a written constitution, Parliament is omnipotent. No judicial department can question its acts. But in America, the case is different. Every state in the Union operates under a constitution, a fundamental law reduced to written exactitude by the people in their sovereign capacity. Patterson uses an astronomical metaphor. The Constitution is the sun of the political system. The legislature is its creature, deriving all power from that document, and must move within a strictly prescribed orbit, unable to alter the fundamental law. Therefore, any legislative act that leaves its orbit and opposes a constitutional principle is absolutely void, and crucially, it is the duty of the coordinate judicial branch to declare it null. Patterson applies this framework in a systematic review of the Confirming Act against the written Pennsylvania Declaration of Rights. The first flaw is the taking itself. Patterson argues that transferring land from one citizen to another requires an extreme, urgent state necessity, not mere political convenience. The second flaw is the valuation. Even if state necessity is proven, the legislature cannot constitutionally act as the sole judge of the compensation value through its own state-appointed board. To ascertain the value of seized land legally, the Constitution requires either mutual stipulation, mutually elected commissioners, or the intervention of a jury. Patterson defines the jury specifically as the ultimate constitutional barrier against legislative overreach. It is the necessary check that preserves private property from state seizure. The third flaw concerns the currency of the exchange. In the Confirming Act, the state attempted to pay for seized land with other land, rather than money. Patterson argued that a true recompense in value, a quid pro quo, requires a universal medium. Money is the only standard that allows for precise exchangeable value. While an owner can accept land as compensation, it must be their free choice. Forcing a specific plot of land upon a proprietor strips them of the volition required to legalize the exchange. The Confirming Act failed every constitutional requirement of eminent domain. It lacked proven necessity, bypassed the jury, and forced an illegal currency. Because the Confirming Act violated the written Constitution, Patterson applied the dead letter doctrine. An unconstitutional law is invalid from the beginning. It never had life or operation. The mechanical consequence of this doctrine is absolute. Legally, it is as if the Confirming Act was never written. The property lines immediately revert to their original state. Patterson provides a fallback argument based on statutory construction. Even if one assumes the Confirming Act was constitutional, any statute that attempts to divest a citizen of their property must be construed with absolute strictness by the courts. This requires evaluating conditions precedent. The Act required the Connecticut claimants to perform specific, literal acts, like proving their claims, before title could legally vest. Historically, the Pennsylvania legislature suspended the Confirming Act in 1788, long before the Board of Property ever finalized the Connecticut claims. The final verdict rests on a dual foundation. Because the law was unconstitutional, and because the strictly construed conditions precedent were never met, the estate continues entirely in the plaintiff, Thomas Vanhorne. Patterson's ruling left behind a defining maxim regarding property rights in America. It is a right not ex gratia from the legislature, but ex debito from the Constitution. Ex gratia translates to by favor. Ex debito translates to from a debt. Property is not a favor granted by the government, held only at the pleasure of the state. It is a fundamental right owed to the citizen by the Constitution itself. 8 years before the Supreme Court issued its opinion in Marbury v. Madison, Vanhorne's Lessee v. Dorrance operationalized judicial review. It proved that in a republic, the written Constitution operates as the ultimate shield against the omnipotence of the state.